Iran has rejected a US ceasefire proposal to end the war that the US and Israel started against it. Instead, Tehran has issued its own counter-offer, which includes an end to the murder of its leaders, guarantees against future wars, reparations, and recognised control over the Strait of Hormuz. With the two sides still far apart, fighting is continuing on multiple fronts. Iran has launched fresh retaliatory missile and drone attacks against Israel and Gulf states. Meanwhile, the United States is reinforcing its military presence, deploying additional troops to the region amid fears that the conflict could widen even further.
While U.S. and Israeli airstrikes continue to pummel Iran, the Trump administration is also apparently trying to coax Tehran to the negotiating table. Pakistani officials who delivered the plan to Iran summed up Washington's goals: to rein in Iran's nuclear program, limit Iran's ballistic missile program, end Iran's support of regional militias, and reopen and stabilize shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. In return, the U.S. is offering to end sanctions and cooperate with Iran on civilian nuclear power. But so far, Tehran has shown little interest in negotiations.
We state this very clearly. Until it is our will, nothing will go back to the way it was. That will only come about when the very thought of acting against the Iranian nation is completely wiped from your corrupt minds.
So Iran is continuing to launch missiles and drones at Israel and various targets in the region. In Kuwait City, an Iranian drone blew up a fuel tank at the international airport. And in Tel Aviv, an Iranian strike managed to get through Israel's vaunted Iron Dome, damaging these apartments. The U.S. has also announced it's deploying at least 1,000 troops of its elite 82nd Airborne Division. They'll be supplementing the some 50,000 troops already in the region. Military experts say the airborne troops could be used to launch attacks on airfields or islands in the Persian Gulf.
Well, let's look at where we are now with a historian. Stephen Worthheim is a historian of US foreign policy and an analyst at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome to DW. So we have Iran rejecting these US proposals and countering with its own maximalist offers. Now the US reported to be sending thousands more troops to the region. This doesn't sound like a war that's about to wind down.
It does not. Good to be with you, Phil. I see extremely little evidence that a diplomatic deal is coming together. At best, we're at the beginning of the two sides making contact. The United States, as you mentioned, put out a maximalist proposal, essentially calling for the satisfaction of all of Washington's grievances with Iran over the years: no enrichment of uranium, no missiles, no support for regional proxies. Not going to happen. Now, today, Iran has responded in kind, demanding not only no restrictions on missiles, but also reparations for this war, the ability to go control who goes through the Strait of Hormuz going forward, also not going to happen. So it may be that next week Iran and the United States sit down, perhaps in Pakistan, and open a dialogue. But as of now, if the proposals and counterproposals suggest anything, it's that this war is not likely to stop in the near future.
But here's the thing, not only about those offers and the counterproposals, but also about any prospect of talks between these two sides. It's hard to see why Iran would trust any offer that the United States comes up with, or indeed agreed to, given that the US was the prime mover behind the 2015 nuclear deal, which Donald Trump then tore up in his first term, and the fact that America and Israel started their bombing campaign during actual negotiations with Iran. Why would Iran trust an interlocutor like that?
That is a real problem. The Iranians have good reason to suspect that attempts to negotiate by the Trump administration are a ruse, perhaps meant to buy time so that forces can flow into the region in preparation potentially for an action on the ground with U.S. troops. But Iran has been burned by diplomacy with the United States. The United States and Iran did a pragmatic nuclear deal in 2015 under the Obama administration that just managed to pass muster in the U.S. Congress, but Republicans were heavily opposed to it. Many Democrats had misgivings. The deal ultimately failed, not because Iran didn't comply, but because, in a sense, it complied. And what enough influential people in the United States feared was an Iran that would be normalized in its influence in the region without a nuclear weapon, in my view. And so Donald Trump tore up the nuclear deal, said he wanted a new one, but has, in his second term, made demands like zero uranium enrichment, which Iran does have a right to do at low levels suitable only for civilian use. That was a kind of poison pill. And now twice in the midst of negotiations, the United States and Israel have attacked Iran.
You talk there about the way that Iran has now become viewed by American politicians. And I've been reading some of your writings, and you talk about how the toxicity of the US political establishment's view of Iran has effectively led to this war being inevitable because no reasonable deal could be done that would be acceptable to a bogeyman that has been blown up to such proportions.
Yeah, I'm afraid that looks like it's the case in hindsight. There was a good chance with the Iran nuclear deal, something I thought was an eminently worthwhile proposition. But I think in retrospect, President Obama said at the time, it was either the nuclear deal or war. In a sense, he was right. When the nuclear deal was ripped up, we've now got a war. But in a larger sense, he was also wrong. At the end of the day, a nuclear deal was tried. It was effective on its own terms, but it foundered when it came into contact with American politics. And we got both the nuclear deal and war. So I'm left wondering, what was the space between U.S. domestic politics and Iran's own ambitions, its domestic politics, if you will, to conclude a meaningful agreement that could get us off the path toward war, toward this problem festering until one day a more ambitious, radical leader decided he wanted to take action to try and solve it once and for all. That's Donald Trump.
Okay, so let's see if you can have a go at answering your own question. Is there an off-ramp for either side?
Well, in this conflict, I don't see many signs of an off-ramp right now. Iran, its priority is to reestablish deterrence, to make sure that if this current war ends, there won't be another attack in a few months or a few years. So I think Tehran is aiming to put strain on the American economy in particular to try to prevent that. Trump, for his part, has a poor record of concluding actual deals, never mind his rhetoric about always wanting to make a deal. So I think in this particular conflict, the best chance for an off-ramp is if Trump just decides enough is enough. He's won. He's going to claim victory. He wants to stop. He tells Israel to stop. That leaves Iran. Iran will likely continue to try to obstruct shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. But over time, its ability to do that is likely to diminish as more and more countries around the world tell it that this is a big problem and Iran should cut it out at this point. So I think the best off-ramp right now is actually a halt to the fighting by one side, hopefully followed by the other, as opposed to a diplomatic agreement. But that really just begs the question that you asked also, what comes after that? Right. There really does need to be a diplomatic solution to this problem.
But let's talk about Israel, which you said almost as though it was a given, and then the United States tells Israel to stop, and then everything proceeds. How likely is Israel to feel bound by a deal between Washington and Tehran? And is Donald Trump actually the man to stand up to Benjamin Netanyahu to make any deal stick?
Well, those are very good questions. I do think that in this case, what I envision isn't a deal between the U.S. and Tehran, but rather a U.S. decision to stop the war. And I think the United States does have a lot of leverage over Israel's government and Benjamin Netanyahu in particular. Netanyahu needs to run for re-election soon, and he needs Donald Trump's support for that. And at the end of the day, the United States has direct material leverage through aerial refueling and the like in terms of Israel's own ability to conduct attacks on Iran, as well as to provide air defense against Iranian missiles and drones coming to Israel. So, the U.S. has the leverage, but you're absolutely right. It's not a complete given that Netanyahu won't find some way to act as a spoiler.
OK, you mentioned Netanyahu standing for re-election in Israel. Let's talk about American politics. I've seen polls indicating that anywhere between 53% and 59% of Americans oppose this war. With midterms in November, is that disposition likely to meaningfully constrain a president with approval ratings bouncing below 40%?
It certainly ought to. In almost any other circumstance, I would say yes, it will. The level of support from the American public from this war is historically low, and it's been dropping over time. But it's not clear that Trump is listening. His audience right now seems to be the history books, not actual living and breathing Americans. Whether it's with Greenland or Venezuela or Cuba or Iran, he seems to be trying to achieve big things to remake the map of the world so that he can become one of the great presidents of the United States, not just a two-term president. The other issue, I think, also is that global markets are so far behaving as though the war will end soon, and Trump has had some success in manipulating those expectations by market participants. And a lot of the economic effects of this war lie in the future, but Trump lives in the perpetual present. So I do think he will likely take these factors into account as we move forward, but it may take, unfortunately, a good deal of time for it to catch up with him.
Good talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Stephen Worthheim from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Well, Sara Bazoobandi is a non-resident research fellow at the Institute for Security Politics at Germany's Kiel University. Welcome back to DW. Lots in this situation that is confused and uncertain. Iran has rejected an American offer while denying that there are talks. Tehran says the war will end when its conditions are met. What can you tell us about those conditions?
Thank you for having me. Yes, the conditions that Iran is putting on the table seems to be a little bit even more maximalist than those that they had in the Geneva talks, just in on the eve of the current crisis, which was mostly to do with the nuclear program and lift up the sanctions. Now they want to have complete removal of all the U.S. bases, dismantling all the U.S. presence across the region. They are also asking for a system similar to that of Turkey in Bosphorus Strait, for example, or the Suez Canal, for example, that the Egyptian government has to charge ships and tankers that are passing through Strait of Hormuz. They also are asking for some sort of security structure that involves only Iran and other neighboring countries in controlling the strait in exchange for, obviously, sanctions lift and stopping and some form of ceasefire or ending the crisis.
So there's lots in there that indicates Iran is not in a mood to compromise. On the other side, it's been reported without confirmation from Washington that the US is about to deploy 1,000 troops from the 82nd Airborne Division to the Middle East, plus about 5,000 Marines and thousands of sailors. This is said to be for a possible invasion of Kharg Island. Tell us about Kharg Island and how invading it might advance American and Israeli military efforts.
Khark Island is very critical for Iranian oil sector because most of the oil production is based there. Oil tankers are moving around the island, and it's also geographically located in a very strategic point just before the strait. So whoever has control of the island could technically claim control over the strait, but also the city, which is very close to the strait, is Bandar Abbas, and Bandar Abbas has been under a lot of attacks. There is also speculation that there might be some form of ground operation in mainland of Iran, which, quite frankly, I'm not sure if it's going to lead to end of the crisis or securing the Strait of Hormuz or the oil tankers or energy transportation through that body of water. But definitely some form of escalation is on the way.
Right.
That is, if I'm trying to read the tea leaves, that is my prediction. I don't see these talking about talks leading to any form of de-escalation.
Thanks for that, Sara. Sara Bazoobandi from Kiel University's Institute for Security Politics.
Thank you.
Natan Sachs is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I asked him if he can see a clear strategy behind the U.S. military campaign against Iran.
Clear strategy usually demands careful planning and a thoughtful process, interagency process, as we call it here in Washington, D.C. That has not been the characteristic of this administration. Instead, the president prides himself on working on instinct. Some of his instincts are bad, but some of them are good. And I would suggest that that is more what we're seeing now, not so much strategy. That can work in certain instances, especially very short wars, short operations. In a lengthy one like this, it becomes far more complicated, and the strategy is being made as they go along. They're building the plane while they fly it.
What about just basic goals? I mean, when you start a war, you generally want to achieve a very particular outcome. Is it clear what outcome Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel are hoping to achieve there?
I think there are three different types of outcomes, and all were in play. And I think my guess is that the president was hoping for any of the above. The first, of course, was the maximum goal, which is regime change. If the regime in Iran changed, either in a minimal way, like Trump would accept, I think, or in a maximal way, like Netanyahu was hoping for, it would indeed change the Middle East. It would be dramatic, first of all, for the people of Iran. They could have a far, far better government that enjoys much more legitimacy domestically, but also it would be wonderful news not only for Israelis, but for Lebanese, for Iraqis, for Yemenis, for many others, perhaps for Palestinians. But of course, that goal may not be achieved. The secondary goal was simply a massive degradation of Iran's capacity, both in terms of its ballistic missile capacity, the medium-range ones that can reach Israel and elsewhere, but also the short-range ones that are pounding now Gulf neighbors of Iran, and its other abilities that would support the nuclear program, including air defenses and others. The third option, which I think appealed to Donald Trump much more than it did to Benjamin Netanyahu, was that the threat of the use of force, with the huge buildup of force before the war or the beginning of the war, and even now, would push Iran back to negotiations towards a deal, which of course is how President Trump sees himself, the ultimate deal maker. And any one of these three goals, either regime change, the best one from their perspective, or a massive degradation of Iran's power, and at the same time pushing Iran towards a deal, gaining leverage for the United States in sort of the art of the deal fashion of Donald Trump, all those goals, I think, are present simultaneously. And that's part of why it's so hard for people from the outside, including us, to discern, is because I think they are all actually in play.
A few days ago, you wrote an article saying that if the goal of a regime change is not achieved, it will be much harder and more complicated to contain Iran. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, if regime change happens, as I said, it could be great news, depending on what regime emerges. It could also be worse. But if it doesn't happen, then we're probably reverting to something along the lines of forceful containment, which was the Israeli strategy for a very long time, and at some points in time also America's strategy, although not always. And that demands a few things. It demands the credible ability to deter Iran from retaliating massively in a way that would escalate into war anytime you try to strike something as part of this containment. then if Iran retaliates in a big way, then you return back to war. The problem now is that with regime change on the table and this very heavy campaign against Iran, Iran has far less to lose. It has also already used its sort of doomsday weapons, especially closing the Straits of Hormuz and bringing a lot of damage to the world economy. That already is in play. And that means that low-grade containment, as it was before, becomes much more complicated in the future. We may see a scenario where it is either, again, full-scale war of this kind that could be very damaging to Iran's neighbors and the world economy, or potentially, if the United States changes its mind in particular, we may see Iran being able to build up its munitions again, perhaps even its nuclear program. And so it becomes a high-risk game. It doesn't mean you can't win that gamble, but it means it's risky.
Iran has so far not shown much interest in negotiating peace on America and Israel's terms. Does Iran have the stronger position here?
It's a two-way answer. On the one hand, Iran has a stronger position in the sense that it simply doesn't want to lose, right? Damage to its own country, damage to its people seems to matter less to this regime. And in this kind of asymmetric warfare, all they need to do is survive as a governing regime and they can declare victory. And as a result, they can continue this for quite a while because they have so much less sensitivity to damage to their own country, which is not always the case. There are many instances where this regime in Iran has been far more sensitive. But in this war, at this moment, it seems like they are very content to continue. Nonetheless, the damage to Iran's capacity and to this regime's capacity is enormous. It is far greater, certainly, than that in Israel or in any of the Gulf neighbors of Iran, and certainly the United States, which is very far away. And so from a purely rational perspective, you would suggest the United States has certainly the stronger hand, but the asymmetric aspect of this warfare could point in the other direction. I'll just point that at the moment, it looks like Iran has a bit of the upper hand because of the closing of the Straits of Hormuz, but we should not lose sight not only to of the damage to Iran's economy, but also to the regime itself. The regime, nonetheless, still prioritizes, first and foremost, its own survival.
Right.
And the destruction to not just the country, but itself can lead it to negotiations as well.
You've described this war as a big gamble of rolling the dice from the perspective of the U.S. and for Israel. If Iran refuses to accept Donald Trump's demands, if Iran survives, where will that leave the U.S.?
Well, if Iran, we certainly hope would survive. If the regime in Iran survives, it would leave the U.S. with this conundrum of how do you contain it with still the hope that the Americans and the Israelis have that regime change could happen, maybe not in the short term, but in the longer term. And of course, none of us know for sure. Regime change is extremely hard to predict. That's part of the problem in the strategy. But it also means that it could happen in the next months or years. We don't know in detail what is happening inside the leadership of this regime and what kind of fissures might emerge within that leadership in the future. So in a sense, it becomes a game of time. Can Iran postpone any new conflict? Can it postpone any new damage to its regime while it builds itself, the regime builds itself again? And from the American and Israeli perspective, might it fall in the meantime?
Indeed, by Iran, of course. I'm at the Iranian regime right now. Can you think of a scenario, Natan, that might lead Iran to the Iranian regime to accept a truce?
Yes, it's not impossible to imagine. I think we tend to sort of have assumptions about the Iranian regime from the outside. And of course, it's a bit of a black box, but it's especially a black box today. They are so fearful that, again, their leadership will be killed, that they are conducting things in a very compartmentalized way, and it's very hard for us to read from the outside. We certainly may see the Iranian regime opt to limit the damage, to end the huge destruction to itself, but also to the Iranian economy, and hope to cut a deal and move forward. We have seen Iran take this kind of pragmatic approach in the past when it has seen the threat of force in front of it. That could be the case now. There's always, however, the danger that more hardliners are calling the shots now, people especially from the Revolutionary Guard, and they may be more inclined towards a long fight. After all, they survived the 8-year war in the Iran-Iraq war, and they may be inclined for a very long war that causes the United States and Israel to hesitate before doing so again. So Iran does have that interest as well. This is a long way of saying we genuinely do not know, because there's a lot of opacity about the Iranian regime itself, the leadership, and what kind of decisions it could make. And certainly the pounding that Iran is taking at the moment would lead many leaders, I think, towards considering a pragmatic approach.
Natan, thanks for speaking with us today. That was Natan Sachs, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington.
Thank you very much.